The hottest programs are always science-based programs, but how much closer do those programs actually get you to your training goals? In the fitness industry, we are attracted by buzzwords, science-based, hypertrophy protocols, you name it. A lot of the time, the science-based programs get a lot of draw in, but what does that actually mean? Are people actually doing scientific studies and driving their clients' growth through science? Not really. Science is here to explain things, and we're going to talk about why science-based programs aren't always the greatest for 99% of the athletes. The first point we're going to get into is science-based programs are too technical. Athletes just want to train. The exercise selection can be extremely odd in these programs. It can be too difficult to set up, and it can be too strange for the athlete or too unfamiliar for the athlete to actually induce any stress to get any adaptation out of. When we start looking at anatomical positions in the body and how the body's meant to move and what rotational exercise or contralateral exercise we can throw into our program because the science says that we need to be doing stuff like this, it can actually take away from the athlete's ability to put in heavy loads and stress the body because they're too worried about, did I do the setup right? Did I do the movement correctly? Is this the right movement for what I'm trying to train? And it becomes this too technical of a component where the athlete starts to overthink things and they don't have fun with their program anymore. Getting into another aspect of the too technical standpoint is we have things like VO2 maxes, lactate thresholds, heart rate monitoring, respiration rates. Those are all different components that scientific studies have told us to focus in on. But in order to measure a lot of these things or working to improve them, like your respiration strength or respiration rate, we need to have a bunch of technical tools and equipment, and these things can take away from the actual training session and they create a high barrier to entry. In reality, most people just need effort. They need to go out and push themselves hard in order to adapt to things. When you're starting to get into high levels of training, like the world's greatest Ironman, Christoph Blumenfeld, you can start to look at some of these principles to drive your training. And we're not trying to be an anti-science organization with this video. We do believe that science offers protocols to help out and guide your training. But when you're getting into the top 1% or 0.1% in the world of endurance training, we can start to look at scientific studies driving our training protocols. Christoph Blumenfeld is the greatest Ironman in the world, and he uses a lot of lactate threshold training where he's actually taking blood lactate as he's going, as well as VO2 monitoring where he's taking his VO2 as he's training. It gives his coach a lot of underlying data to direct where his training needs to be. Most people, this is way too much work for them to do inside of an actual training session. Taking your blood lactate, putting on a mask to monitor your VO2 while you're breathing heavy, getting a pulse oximeter to check your oxygen saturation levels. It becomes, again, too much of a task, and it pulls away from people's actual efforts. Ultimately, adaptation comes down to effort and creating stress inside of the body. When we get into too technical of things, we take away from that effort standpoint, and we might actually reduce or give ourselves a reason to pull back on a specific workout. My VO2 max is too high, my heart rate's too high, my breathing is out of control. We're never going to be able to perfectly control our body to make something feel easy, and at the end of the day, getting amazing performance results or testing results comes down to effort. And in training, we need to develop the ability to have effort. A lot of these tools can take away from our ability to create effort in our training. When we're focused on the science, training programs can become too detail-oriented. And this is our second point. Oftentimes, programs will get fixated on a specific physiological metric that they're trying to improve. So they might be focused on their respiration rate, their heart rate, their blood lactate, their VO2 max, and focused and dialed in that program might be focused and dialed in on improving that sole metric. When in reality, all of those things are going on at one time in the body. The body is also too complex to really dial into what it is that is causing fatigue substrates in a workout or a test, whatever it might be, and it's oftentimes day to day. To give you an idea of how complex the human body is, recently researchers have been discovering that DNA can be used as a storage device. To give you as an example of how much data can be stored on DNA, it's estimated that humanity will generate 33 zettabytes of data, which is 3.3 followed by 22 zeros, and that DNA can store all of that data onto a ping pong ball worth of DNA. So what we're coated with in our body has immense storage power. And for us as humans to try and finite down to a simple VO2 max lactate threshold that's driving our training or weakness in a specific sport is a little bit of a egotistical way to look, or a simplified way to look at training. We are extremely complex creatures, and there is a lot that goes on in the body that we will never understand. And so when we are looking at driving training adaptations, we always want to bring it back to the principle of effort drives those adaptations. Along with it being too detail-oriented of a program, science will always tell us the how. It will never tell us the why. There's a great African runner whose name is escaping me right now. It might be Kipchoge, but his coach was never taught scientific principles. He coached off of what he was viewing and how he was seeing Kipchoge run. When exercise scientists found out about this, they decided to run tests on this runner and found that the principles that the coach was giving the runner were exactly what they would be giving a runner based off of scientific methods. The coach just intuitively knew what he needed to do with the runner. And the runner intuitively knew how to put in effort inside of his training. And so again, we always want to bring it back to effort. The third point that we want to make on this is that science can be too restrictive. Athletes need room to play around, have fun, grow. We learn through doing games and figuring out our body, experimenting with our body. If we're told to just go do this exercise on a piece of paper with no real nuances to it, it's just straightforward, very robotic, A, B, C, D. There's no room for growth as an athlete. You're just going through the motions. We want to have athletes that are allowing for wiggle room inside of their training. Athletes aren't robots. Not every day is going to feel good. There's too many chaotic variables that come into play for us to have a perfect regimented training routine day in and day out. And this also goes back to the body is complicated. The world is also complicated. We could be breathing in smoke from a wildfire in Alaska one day or Canada and not be able to elicit as much intensity as maybe a science-based program would want us to. And so we need to have that wiggle room in our training in order to account for the variables of life and of training. When we get into things like VO2 maxes and lactate thresholds and heart rate monitors, we're putting a lot of restrictions and putting ourselves inside of boxes that won't allow us to explore how we're doing on a specific day. There was a philosophy of training when I first started that was along the lines of, if it feels good, go for a max. Those are what we're trying to elicit inside of training, is finding where our maximum potential is. And the idea behind this is that there's so many variables that go on in the world. If you're feeling good on a given day and you feel like you got it, go for it, because that is going to raise your ceiling and push your bar a little bit forward along the way. And if we're stuck to a program or stuck to a specific training physiology or adaptation we're trying to get out of, we will never find out on our best days where we're at. And so we want to make sure that we're not being too restrictive with the athletes in what it is we're giving them training wise, and allowing them to have some variability in their training. Now, a lot of this sounds like we hate science, and we don't. We understand that scientific principles are great for helping develop the protocols of training. Kind of like what we talked about with Chris on, is that we can take those data points and figure out principles or training protocols that will help drive some of that adaptation or improve those performances. We definitely train athletes on heart rate monitors all the time. We have done lactate threshold intervals with athletes. We understand that there are a lot of scientific principles or scientific studies and things that we know about the body that can help us with training. But we also believe that there is an art form to coaching, and it is not just following the science, but it is also learning and understanding the athlete and what they respond to best. Sometimes you're going to have to learn the scientific principles behind things so that you can explain to that athlete and get them to buy in. A lot of the time, coaching comes from trusting, and the athlete needs to trust you know what you're talking about and why something might be happening in the body. That why is a huge buy-in for a lot of athletes into their training program. And oftentimes, the most important thing inside of a training program is the buy-in. And so if you're an athlete that buys into scientific training protocols, you might become one of the best in the world by doing scientific training. You also might not buy into scientific training, but you like to understand the why behind it. And you want to have more fun in the gym, fun in your training, and create a little bit more chaotic of an environment. And your buy-in might look different than another's athlete's buy-in. But as coaches, we always need to know what is going on so that we can explain to the athlete, if they need to know, what is happening and why we're trying to do something a specific way. Science also builds a great base for coaches to build off of. In today's day and age, coaches can hit the ground running a lot faster than they did 30, 40, even 20 years ago. There's a lot of more information out there that has come through science telling us why things work so well. And coaches can pick up on that and develop protocols for their athletes a lot faster. The rate of knowledge for an athlete now takes 2 to 3 years to get them really good at developing programs and protocols, where before it could take upwards of 4 to 6 years for an athlete to be fine-tuned on what it is they were trying to give athletes. We need to look at studies or be looking at studies and interpreting those studies in how we might use or set up a protocol for our athletes. So this whole video hasn't been to completely trash science. It's needed, but we also need to understand that athletes aren't robots, and we need to intermix the two in order to get the best results from them. If you're looking for a coach, we would love to help you guys out. You can head over to our website or get in contact with us on Instagram. We'll catch you guys next time.